Number 8. Exnormal de Perot. In a wooded area outside the city of Perote in Veracruz, Mexico, there's a lone concrete building that looks like it belongs in a populated area rather than in the middle of nowhere. The conspicuously out-of-place structure was built during the 1950s as a tuberculosis hospital, which explains its remote location. Known as the Escuela Normal de Perot or Perote Normal School, it also functioned as a teacher's college during its years of operation. The military seized the building during what's known as the Mexican Movement of 1968, when university students across Mexico began protesting en masse for political changes, including a shift away from the authoritarianism that dominated the country at the time. Operations at the normal school never resumed, and the building remains abandoned to this day. It's dilapidated, covered in a demonic-looking graffiti, and supposedly haunted. It's a popular attraction among explorers who are seeking an off-the-beaten-path experience, but it's also a great place for photographers due to the uninterrupted view of the surrounding area that's offered from the top floor. Number 7. Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. In rural Weston, West Virginia, there's an eerie, Gothic-style building that once housed patients suffering from mental illness and addiction. Construction on the hospital, originally called the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, began during the 1850s. It was still being built when it accepted its first patients in 1864, and it was finally completed in 1881. With its own farm, dairy, water system, and cemetery, the sprawling 666-acre property was meant to be self-sufficient. It was built to house 250 patients, but quickly became overcrowded due to the tendency to institutionalize people for things that are not considered mental illnesses in today's world, including personality flaws like laziness and greed. Wives were often dropped off by their husbands, who were able to have their spouse committed without giving much of a reason. The hospital's population peaked during the 1950s at 2,600 patients. By then, the hospital was notorious for being unsanitary and for failing to properly care for patients. As a result, many people died. Nobody knows the exact number of deaths, which researchers are working to determine and have estimated to possibly be in the thousands. Patients who were deemed uncontrollable were sometimes locked in cages. Others had parts of their brain removed during forced lobotomies, and patients often languished in solitary confinement for days or months at a time. At least a handful of murders occurred over the years between the patients. The patient population at the institution decreased dramatically during the 1980s due to widespread changes in the treatment of mental illness in the United States. At the same time, the hospital's condition was deteriorating. It was closed in 1994 and now operates as a historic landmark, offering heritage and ghost tours to the public. Given the terrible things that happened at the asylum, many people believe that the ghosts of former patients continue to inhabit the building today. One of the most famous ghosts is a girl named Lily, who can be heard laughing and playing from time to time. A man named Dean, who was murdered by fellow patients, is also an established presence at the former hospital. Efforts to restore the building are ongoing, as it becomes increasingly popular as a tourist destination. Would you like to visit this creepy asylum? Let us know in the comments and hit subscribe while you're at it. Number 6. Gunam Psychiatric Hospital. One of South Korea's most notorious haunted hospitals, known as the Gunam Asylum, was built at the foot of a mountain in the small city of Gwangju in 1961. Legends describe this three-story structure as a torturous hellhole where vast numbers of patients died while under the care of murderous and abusive doctors. According to one myth, doctors and other staff members were often driven to madness by the patients they treated. Ever since Gunam's closure in 1996, stories have circulated like wildfire, with some claiming that the hospital was shut down due to the mistreatment of patients, while another version of events revolves around the owner's mysterious death. In reality, the facility closed mainly due to financial struggles that it encountered during a period of economic downturn. By the time it shuttered its doors, the hospital desperately needed a new sewage system. Authorities would not allow it to reopen without one, leading to extensive disagreements between the owner and public officials. Negotiations were still underway when the owner died in 1997, and his children did not want to deal with the headache of getting the hospital back up and running. While the reality of Gunam's closure is much less interesting than the tales people tell about doctors going insane and murdering patients, it's still likely that some disturbing things went on there. In an era when mental illness was less understood than it is today, mistreatment at psychiatric institutions was not only common, it was essentially a fixture at most residential treatment facilities. Gunam also has a reputation for being one of the most haunted places in South Korea, with many explorers claiming to have seen ghosts during their visits. Number 5. Beachworth Asylum. Also known as Mayday Hills, the Beachworth Asylum was opened in 1867 in Victoria, Australia. It was one of the largest facilities of its kind in the country, consisting of 67 buildings and housing over 1,200 patients at its peak. Like many other mental hospitals of the time, the sprawling complex was designed to be self-sufficient, with its own gardens, orchards, and livestock. Patients also had access to recreation and entertainment, including a tennis court, a theater, and a cricket pavilion. The Beachworth Asylum was surrounded by what's known as a ha-ha wall. Built into a trench, the barrier looked a lot shorter to outsiders than it actually was, done on purpose to prevent the hospital from resembling a prison, and could perhaps be considered a metaphor for how things really were different behind closed doors than they seemed from the outside. More than 9,000 patients are believed to have died at Beachworth, where individuals were allegedly subjected to treatments that are considered inhumane today. In 1951, 11 male patients escaped, while a fire raged through one of the buildings. According to a newspaper report from the time, around 400 mostly naked men had to be rescued from inside the burning structure. Most of the patients who passed away at the hospital were buried in unmarked graves on the property. Sadly, many of them probably didn't even need to be hospitalized. For many years, the requirements to get someone committed were extremely basic, requiring little more than the signatures of a family member and a doctor. But getting released was a lot more difficult, at one point requiring 8 signatures testifying to the patient's ability to function normally in society and daily life. This meant that if someone felt inconvenienced by a troubled family member or a husband no longer felt like dealing with his wife, they could have that person put away pretty easily just by claiming that they needed to be institutionalized. Beachworth was shut down for good in 1995 after operating for 128 years. Today it's open to visitors, many of whom hope to have a paranormal encounter with one of its many resident ghosts. One of the more commonly seen entities is a woman named Matron Sharp, who reportedly used to sit with patients while they received electroconvulsive shock treatments. Visitors are also known to encounter a groundskeeper named Arthur, who worked in the garden. Both patients and doctors alike are rumored to wander the asylum's halls as if they remain stuck there, even in death. Number 4. The Willard Asylum for the Insane. Described by Insider as one of the creepiest abandoned hospitals in the United States, the Willard Asylum for the Insane was the country's largest mental institution at one time. Opened in 1869 in Seneca County, New York, the hospital was built as an alternative to placing mentally ill people in poor houses, where they languished in squalid conditions without proper care and were often mistreated. The Willard Asylum was designed to treat patients suffering from all forms of mental illness who were unable to care for themselves and had nobody else to care for them. Male and female patients were housed separately, and the staff also kept individuals who were deemed violent separate from those who were considered non-violent. By 1877, the hospital was home to 1,500 patients who were treated humanely and afforded a relative degree of freedom compared to the conditions at most asylums at the time. Many were allowed to roam the property, and the facility's farm provided jobs to those who were well enough to work while also offering recreational activities. But there was also a dark side to things that went on at Willard Asylum. Patients were often subjected to treatments that are considered inhumane by modern standards, including ice baths and electroshock therapy with no sedation. Thousands of people died at the property, including many who likely arrived under the impression that their stay would be temporary. Shortly after the Willard Asylum closed in 1995, an employee found 400 suitcases belonging to former patients in a locked attic. The bags belonged to people who were admitted to the hospital between 1910 and 1960, and they were filled with photos, stuffed animals, hygiene items, clothing, and other personal belongings that people had arrived at the hospital with. Several of the hospital's buildings are in use by the Department of Corrections, which maintains the property but have mostly fallen into disrepair. Until recently, the DOC offered occasional tours of the property, but the tours were discontinued due to growing concerns about the safety hazards posed by the deteriorating buildings. Number 3. Versi Psychiatric Hospital. Built in the early 1930s, the Versi Psychiatric Hospital was one of Italy's largest insane asylums during its years of operation. The sprawling complex occupied nearly 70 acres and consisted of 20 pavilions, at least 13 of which are completely abandoned today, as well as a small church. Inside some of the pavilions were a gymnasium, an auditorium, a children's area, and an area for patients' relatives. One area, known as the Carlo Forlanini Pavilion, housed the most severely mentally ill patients in small rooms. They underwent experimental treatments such as electroconvulsive therapy, which took place in the basement. During World War II, retaliating partisans massacred a group of fascist soldiers at the site. The Paglia law, which required the dismantling of Italy's mental hospitals, went into effect in 1978, causing the Versi facility to close. Several pavilions were turned into a regular hospital, which remained in operation until 1991. The local health authority manages but does not use the property, and the area that remains in use houses an environmental association office. French photographer and urban explorer Sylvain Margin gained access to the off-limits buildings in 2015 and snapped pictures of the decrepit, dust-covered ruins. Humidity has destroyed the walls, plaster is crumbling, and thick vegetation has taken over the once manicured yard. Objects like wheelchairs, books, medical paperwork, and psychiatry magazines remain as an eerie reminder of the past goings-on in the now dark and silent buildings. Number 2. Paglia. Paglia is a small island located less than a half a mile from Venice in Italy's Venetian lagoon. It was first inhabited as early as the 5th century and was home to a civilian population until 1379, when war forced its residents to flee. In 1776, Paglia became a quarantine station for plague victims and patients who were suffering from other contagious diseases. From 1922 to 1968, the site operated as a mental hospital. The island has remained vacant ever since, despite efforts in recent years to turn it into a luxury vacation destination. More than 160 patients died in Paglia over the centuries. It's rumored that as much as half of the island's soil contains human remains. Archaeologists have found mass graves containing the remains of thousands of plague victims on nearby islands, but Paglia itself is yet to be fully investigated. According to legend, a doctor who worked at the mental hospital in Paglia tortured and killed patients before butchering their corpses. While these claims remain unsubstantiated, the remains of the hospital are still there, slowly being reclaimed by nature. Naturally, many people believe Paglia is haunted, but the island currently remains off-limits to visitors, and there's no word on if or when it will open up to tourism. For now, those who are curious about the supernatural can visit the nearby island of San Servolo, where the remains of an insane asylum are preserved as a museum. And at number 1, Ridgelea Hospital. Built in 1916 in Lancaster, England, Ridgelea Hospital was meant to function as a woman's ward of the nearby Lancaster Moor Mental Asylum. Its staff prioritized treating patients humanely, which was unusual for the time. The hospital experienced a major decline in its number of patients during a period in the 80s and 90s known as deinstitutionalization, when British leadership restructured its philosophy around mental health care toward keeping as many people out of hospitals as possible. Ridgelea officially closed in 2013 and rapidly fell into a state of disrepair. Since then, the site has attracted looters, vandals, and curious explorers. Unlike many abandoned institutions, there are no major reports of Ridgelea being haunted, but the neglected property is dangerous for other reasons, prompting public officials to plead with the public to stop trespassing onto the site. It's filled with asbestos, lead paint, broken glass, and other hazards that could easily result in injury or put someone's health in jeopardy. In recent years, the current property owners asked the government for permission to demolish the derelict hospital, noting that it's too damaged to be worth fixing up and repurposing. The local council denied the request, citing a lack of information regarding the possible environmental impacts of tearing the building down. Thanks for watching. Which one of these hospitals creep you out the most? Tell us in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe. See you soon. Bye for now.